One thing that Carol didn't mention is that after reading the 2013 Closing the Opportunity Gap book, Carol suggested that we create a recognition program for high schools that are in fact closing the opportunity gap as opposed to simply enrolling students with high test scores. And we ran with that idea. We're about to announce, we're working on finalizing, so in January we'll announce our third year of recognized schools of opportunity. So thank you, Carol. So I'm going to talk about school choice, particularly private school voucher approaches, and more particularly two relatively new approaches to vouchers. I'm going to speak only for 10 minutes, and Carol's going to hold me honest with regard to that, because otherwise I will go on much longer. So I want to do just two things. Explain what these policies are, the basic structure of how they work, and briefly also touch on why voucher advocates are turning to these new approaches. So this is from our friends at the Freedom Foundation, now called EdChoice, that actually have a very well-funded and fancy website that has all sorts of information about these sorts of programs. And this will give you an idea of where these different programs exist. So you have traditional vouchers are in orange, tax credit scholarships, or what I call neo-vouchers, are in sort of the greenish color, and education savings accounts, which Oscar will be focusing on, are in the sort of purplish color. And you'll see with some of these states that they have multiples. So our favorite states like Florida and Arizona. What I want to do, I have a couple diagrams here, one for neo-vouchers or tuition tax credit vouchers, one for these new education savings accounts approach system. So this is the one that shows you how we could think about old style vouchers as opposed to neo-vouchers or whatever, tuition tax credit vouchers. So in the old style, you have the state government collecting tax money and then having a budget item of allocation of money to fund these vouchers. So the vouchers go to the parents take the vouchers to the schools, sign over the vouchers, and the school takes the voucher to the state and collects the money. In the tuition tax credit systems, you add a couple new players. Taxpayers owe money to the state. The state gives a tax credit to those taxpayers if the taxpayers donate the money to a nonprofit corporation. In Arizona, they're called school tuition organizations. In other states, they have some different names. So I owe, say, a couple $100 in taxes to the state. I give that money to my favorite school tuition organization. The school tuition organization gives the money to the parent to sign over to the school, which then collects the money not from the state, but from the school tuition organization. And the way the state government gets involved is what's called a tax expenditure. They, instead of allocating the money, they give the money as a tax credit. In other words, they forego the receipt of the money from the taxpayer. And you'll see why that's important in a moment. It has both legal and policy implications. So very quickly, education savings accounts. Again, Oscar's going to be talking more about these. But it's very similar to a traditional voucher, except instead of giving the parent a voucher to sign over to the school, what the state does is it gives the taxpayers who forego public schools and instead homeschool or go to a private school. If they forego the public schools, they get a little debit card. And the debit card has money on it that exists in a state-created account in the name of the parent. The parent then takes that debit card and uses it to pay for school tuition or a variety of other things. Right? So it could be paid for tutoring, it could be saved up and paid for some college expenses, it could be paying for dual enrollment college expenses while the child is in private school or homeschool. So that's the basic structure of the two different or three different approaches. Now why? It seems like it's more complicated. Why not just stick with the traditional voucher? There are political, legal, and regulatory reasons why. Politically, vouchers have been focus grouped and polled. The term voucher has sort of gotten a bad name for some reason. And so the experts in salesmanship came up with different terms. So you'll see scholarship, the word scholarship used. But they also, in up with complicated mechanisms. And so when you have a tax credit bill in your state legislature, you'll find that the news coverage is different than a regular voucher bill. There's some confusion. There's a difficulty reporters have in explaining a tax credit to the readership. And that confusion results in one, less coverage, and two, a different sort of coverage that sort of is not as easy for the reader to say, oh, that's vouchers. That's something that undermines public education. But more importantly, and I think the real reason this was derived is Arizona is where this was originally created. Arizona has a provision in the state constitution, often called Blaine amendments, Blaine language, that is, you can think about it as the federal establishment clause on steroids. So instead of just there shall be no establishment of religion, you have language like, under no circumstances whatsoever shall any state money ever be allocated to support a religious institution. Right? Very strong. Ever, yeah. So that's 5 minutes. I'm about halfway through. So what happened is that because that language prevented an allocation of money to support a religious institution, private religious schools, through vouchers, they came up with this complicated mechanism that I showed you, right? And the key thing here, and what the Arizona Supreme Court agreed with the voucher proponents on with a 3-2 decision, the key thing here is that you don't see a state government allocation going to private schools. You don't even see a state government allocation going to anything. It's foregoing money, right? It's not an allocation. And because there is no allocation or appropriation of state money, the Arizona Supreme Court, again 3-2, said this does not violate that provision of the state constitution. So there's that legal argument. That's the first legal thing. And that there have been 2 cases, Arizona and another state. And then you have this other argument that's actually been more persuasive, more courts have turned to, which is no taxpayer standing. The general rule for standing is that you have to have a sort of an individual harm. There has to be, the plaintiff who's going into court has to be able to say, this is hurting me personally, I therefore am the right person to bring this case. Otherwise, you have people going into court complaining about everything. You know, my neighbor down the street has an objection, and I'm going to be, litigating it on her behalf. So because taxpayers have had difficulty convincing the courts that they, as taxpayers, are going to be harmed when a different taxpayer gets a tax credit, the courts have refused to consider the merits of the challenges to these laws. Finally, regulatory. Very briefly, advocates of vouchers don't want strings attached to a voucher. They don't want to have to administer tests. They don't want to be transparent about their budgets. They don't want any sort of strings attached. They just want the money. It turns out that a traditional voucher is much more likely to have strings attached because it's more traditional allocation of government money. There's no reason that you couldn't have regulations and transparency requirements attached to these other laws, but they're much less likely to have. Okay, I have what, 2 minutes? 2.5. Okay. So, I think just 2 more. Yeah, just 2 more slides, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'll preface briefly, and then we can return during the discussion. The reason why we're only taking 10 minutes is so we can have a lot of time for discussion and questions. So the first slide deals with 10 concerns and abuses. The second is sort of how to address fiscal impact calculations. I'm actually going to quickly go to this one and then go back, just because what you'll see in a lot of states, because a lot of the purpose of these panels is to prepare you for things that are going to take place in your states, you'll see this push for neo-vouchers associated with a claim that they will save the state's money. And the claims generally have a very simplistic and very deceiving calculation underlying them. I'm not gonna, I can go through this later, but you can see that what I'm trying to get at here, and we can go through in detail if you like, is all the different sort of components of that calculation. It's not a straightforward calculation, and at the end of the day, the thing you see highlighted in red there, switchers versus stayers, that's purely guesswork. How many of the recipients of the NEO voucher are people who otherwise would have gone to private school anyway, and how many of them were encouraged by the voucher to switch from public school to private school? That latter group can save the state money, the former group costs the state money. And we don't know in any state what those actual numbers are. In my last minute or so, I'll just quickly run through 10 concerns or abuses that a lot of them you're just gonna nod and say, of course. So I mentioned the lack of transparency, accountability. There are, I think, 2 states that have 2 out of the 17 that have meaningful evaluations attached. And even then, there's very, very little information you can get from the evaluations. Privatization of decision making, you all know about that issue. Discrimination by recipient students, think back to the confirmation hearings for our current Secretary of Education. Earmarked donations is something that exists. I see Steve back there for Georgia. It exists as a Georgia policy. I believe it certainly exists in Arizona and some other states where you can actually say, I am donating this money to the school tuition organization.
Sorry, that's my alarm. I should have triggered it.
I'll finish the sentence and we'll return to this.
There it is.
Wait, can you start the sentence over?
Yeah, I'll just finish it up. So, in these states that allow earmarking, what happens is the earmarking says you cannot earmark this donation to benefit your child, but you can earmark it to benefit a different child. And so what happens is the parents who have kids in a private school just trade earmarks. So I earmark for your child, you earmark for my child, and we both get a subsidy for our child's private school education. So we can go back to these later. I'm going to switch to Oscar's PowerPoint.
I'll try to do it without the alarm this time.
Very good. Don't put the eject button either. So.
No. That's after 30 minutes.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So, a little bit about myself in terms of how I got involved. I do a lot of work in the area of school financing, K-12 education. And, so I go to a lot of the school finance conferences and I run into a lot of economists. And, in one of these sessions, I was talking about vouchers and ESAs and someone stood up and said, those aren't vouchers, education savings accounts. And which I just sort of turned around, didn't respond, and then the whole crowd sort of said, are you kidding me? They're a very similar type of voucher, and as Kevin said, coined as NEO vouchers. And then a foundation in Texas called me up and said, would you be willing to do sort of an environmental scan on ESAs, because Texas was at that point thinking about adopting an ESA program. And now I'm working on a policy brief for the National Education Policy Center through Kevin's shop on this topic. So I just wanted to give you a little background about how I'm involved. So I'm very much in terms of a school choice or school voucher issue, a niche person in terms of education savings accounts. The topic of this, the title of this workshop is, has this phrase, what every public school advocate should know about, education vouchers. In this case, I'll focus on education savings accounts. So there's really 4 things primarily that I think you should know. One is ESA programs are expanding, and expanding rather quickly through legislative action across the United States. Second, state courts have found ESA programs lawful, especially in terms of the Blaine Amendment that Kevin referenced. But the Nevada case actually brings up some other constitutional questions. So it's sort of a mixed results right now. Third, there's a lack of peer review research to support ESA programs, and I'll get what the implications of that are. And then there's serious questions or concerns raised in the literature about the consequences of ESAs. So, in terms of the legislative action, so far 6 states have adopted ESA programs, starting in Arizona in 2011, then Florida 2014, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Nevada in 2015, and most recently in North Carolina in 2017. all of this without any empirical research to support the effectiveness of ESA programs. So in other words, these decisions are based purely on political, ideological reasons and not on the empirical evidence that actually supports the effectiveness of these programs, which I think is very important to note. Second, and related to this note, is that there's direct and explicit advocacy from conservative organizations referenced by Carol and others. So this is not sort of this concerned group of citizenry in each of these states thinking about how to improve public education. It's actually very much sort of designed and incubated and promoted through these conservative think tanks. And then I think it's important to note that there's two models that states adopt, either a targeted model or a universal approach. A targeted model is where they say, we're gonna make eligible students who have a specific type of disability. So it's a very niche program and it's very focused. So right now, the largest program probably has enrolled about 7,000 students. Why? Because they're all sort of these targeted approaches, right? Now there's a danger to that, which I'll get to in a second. The universal approach, which Nevada tried, is to say everyone is eligible to enroll in an education savings account, okay? So I want to make mention that to understand what type of approach is your state thinking about taking. And then even when they select a targeted approach, it never ends there. It expands. So it goes from targeting one specific disability to multiple disabilities. Or it could be radical. So Arizona went from students with disabilities to then students in failing schools, students in reservations, and on and on and on. And then legislatively, there's been pushback from in Arizona. So for example, Arizona, the legislature wanted to expand to full, to a universal model this past legislative session. There was a grassroots movement, Arizona Save Our Schools, that pushed back and said, no, we don't want this. This needs to go to a public vote. So now it's been pushed out, and now there's going to be a proposition to see if Arizona adopts a universal model or not. So next. So through the constitutional questions, there's been 3 different lawsuits in Arizona, Florida, and Nevada. I'll focus on Arizona and Nevada because I think those are the 2 most interesting ones. In Arizona, it was ruled constitutional, okay, back in 2011. And there was 2 reasons for that, and I want to be precise in it. One is that an account is created for the student where the parent can choose to fund various educational services and programs from more than one entity that exercise of parental choice among education options makes the program constitutional. So meaning the only choice isn't just a religious private school. They can do home tutoring, they can do online education, they can actually save the money and use it towards college. So there's a great variety of things that they could use. And then the second rationale was that there can be no finding that the religious clause is violated because the state is not directing where monies go. Any benefit is indirect and neither result in state action where no purpose of the state to directly benefit any religious school. So that was the rationale in Arizona. Both legislatively and litigatively, we need to bring up the point that all of this has been occurring in conservative red states. And many times with the courts being appointed by the governors who are conservative, so appointing conservative judges. There has not been a US Supreme Court ruling on this yet. And again, all of these have been in conservative red states. Now, the Nevada ruling is actually more interesting. They actually said, yes, it's lawful. It doesn't violate the Blaine Amendment but the way that the education, that the state is programmed to fund public education, it violates that constitutional right. So it's not that money is going towards ESAs, but where is the money coming from is the key issue in Nevada. So what they're saying is you need to develop a new funding mechanism or a new funding stream outside of the traditional mechanism that funds public education, if that makes sense. So next, there is a lack of peer-reviewed research. Only 4 journal articles have been published in peer-reviewed sources. None of them have an empirical evaluative analysis about the effectiveness of ESAs. Now, there's a reason for this. Data is not collected. How can you conduct rigorous evaluative research that's at the standard of a peer-reviewed journal article without the data? One, the data some of the data that's available, that's collected, is parent satisfaction. So this is really important because pro-ESA advocates will push that over 90% of the parents are satisfied with their program. Well, if you actually poll, which is a poll, parents, most are actually happy with their child's education, their child's school. They're just not happy with education in general. So there's sort of this conflated notion about what does that actually mean? Parents are actually satisfied. And also, so all of this reemphasizes the point that ESAs have been founded upon and expanded on based on political and ideological purposes, not on any empirical research. So when people start saying that, well, there's research on this that shows the only research that has been done that's actually been discredited because of the methodology is this parent satisfaction stuff. And pro-ESA advocates will then say, well, it's all about choice. And if we have choice, that's really the only thing that matters. So choice, if it creates a lack of accountability, that's okay. Because as long as parents are satisfied, that is the accountability. What? There's stratification and segregation? Well, that's okay. Because that's what individuals had the freedom to choose to do. And then the fiscal impact, Kevin went over this. The fiscal impact is that they claim that, again, because those that use ESAs to go to private schools saves the state money. But again, that's a miscalculation. If we were to take the DC model, any of you from Washington, DC, and we would take 50% enrollment, if the 50% enrollment in Arizona was applied for ESAs, that would cost the state $1 billion in public funds. So there is actually no fiscal savings. In fact, there's an actual fiscal cost to the states. So I think that's it for my part.
So I feel like I have to show slides now. So yeah, it's under,
Cute though.
yeah, I wonder. And I don't need it immediately, so it's under, voucher presentation. So anyway, I'll let you find it. Okay. So good afternoon. It is, thank you, Kara. I just want to say thank you to you and to MPE for inviting me to be here today. This is kind of a homecoming. I actually, as indicated in my bio, used to work for People for the American Way. A lot of the work that I did was putting together reports, and particularly working when it was initiated on the DC voucher program. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Suffice it to say, I remember watching, and because I was advocating at that time on these issues, and I remember watching the vote on the DC voucher program and literally hearing the wrist being broken because they delayed the vote so long and then went back and voted again in order to get this thing passed. And so in effect, it was one of those situations where we knew they were going to do whatever it took to pass this. So my responsibility is to kind of talk about some of the civil rights implications, as well as also I'm going to focus on some of the terminology that's been used when you're talking about vouchers or neo-vouchers or whatever you want to call them. First, I want to kind of put this in a little bit of context. So I introduced myself, but I wanted to say that one of the reasons that I'm passionate about this is because I am a public school grad. I hail from Louisville, Kentucky, if you are familiar with that. That's Jefferson County, where there is currently a desegregation program in place that has evolved from the original consent decree. I was part of that. Class, those classes that were. I wasn't the one who was bused. I had friends who were bused in. Okay. I benefited from that diversity. I benefited from being in the public education system. I benefited from having a global perspective, from understanding democratic values. I have a mother who's a principal, public school teacher, so she didn't force me to go into teaching, but at the same time, she kind of, hinted about the utility of it. So ultimately, that's what I studied in law school. So the things for me that resonate are the fact that this is a civil right for me when I talk about education and talk about the public education experience. And so at the heart of that means that when you discuss the educational experience in public schools, you have to speak to how this evolved. And the utility of having a public education system was about ensuring that you had equal rights and quality education for all students, because that was not being provided prior to Brown v. Board. And sadly, it's still not being provided, but the whole rationale, the reasons for Brown v. Board was about providing the necessary resources, ensuring a quality education for all students. Eventually, after Brown v. Board, you had the evolution of 1965, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, as well as the creation of the Department of Education, which was founded in order to create this system that would ensure that all students have access. And so that's what the Department of Education is about ensuring that quality education for all students. So for me, it's an anathema to talk about how to talk about vouchers, neo-vouchers, in the same context of Brown v. Board, in the same context of providing a quality public education, because if you cannot separate the history and the context of vouchers from this. And so regardless of the terms that you want to use, if you talk about, if you want to say school choice, or what have you, vouchers were created in order to resist Brown v. Board. Privatization schemes were created in order to resist the desegregation, the integration, the diversification, the quality of education for all students. That was the initial impetus, all right? You had the Southern Manifesto, you had Southern states that were closing entire districts. In Alabama, they were closing their schools so that blacks, that they would not have to desegregate. Virginia, my state, closed, all right? And in counties, Prince George's County closed in order to not, Prince Edward's County, excuse me, in order to not allow black students to be sitting next to white students. So for me, it is particularly horrendous to talk about vouchers in the same context of Brown v. Board. And so essentially, and then lastly, I'll just say that the fact that it is often held as some type of component of Christian values, that this is a religious, moral authority that exists in order to provide the school choice and vouchers to young black and brown students, is also, I think, offensive to any one that does have some integrity and understands actually what your value system, whether or not you be a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, I don't care. That whether or not the question is whether or not you believe in ensuring that we all have the right to, we are all created equal, and that we have the right to live and exist in this country equally. That if that is your fundamental base, then the reinterpretation of these values should be offensive to anybody. So that fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of Brown v. Board is where I come into this and what I want to kind of focus on. Let me read a quote, well, some of the language from Brown v. Board, just so we know what we're working with. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. I focus on Brown v. Board because I think that you cannot, again, disconnect the discussion of integration, desegregation, diversification of schools with vouchers. And so I know that we're here to talk about vouchers, but this is all in the same. And so the whole movement right now, in which we're concerned about the loss of public education, also comes on top of the movement of the resegregation of our schools. Yeah. That we've had recent publications that come out by Erica Frankenberg, a friend, over at Penn State, UCLA Civil Rights Project as well, talking about how we're now going back to the resegregation, that essentially we've got several generations of students who are undergoing another shift towards resegregation, and the majority of them are in resegregated schools. We know that that is also happening within the charter schools are contributing to that resegregation. We have studies that speak to the fact that we are at a point in time where we are resegregated as much, if not more, than prior to Brown v. Board. Okay? So if that's the history and that's the context, then you have to think about how it is that you have to think about vouchers in terms of what is the impetus, what are they trying to achieve? Is it about, it's not simply about shifting the resources, it's also about not wanting to ensure a diverse and quality public education for all our students. It's also about not wanting to have integrated schools and classrooms. It's about wanting to keep the resources for one group of students versus another. What is that? That is the underlying underlying reason why Brown v. Board was brought. All right, so this is why they're connected. And terminology really does matter. I know that I probably got 2 minutes left, but let me just say that, and I'm probably not going to get to the slides that I now put up there. So the point of the matter is this.
They're really nice slides.
I know, right? Well, definitely wasn't get to all those. I wanted to at least mention a couple of things that I think, a case and also some things that I did at the department. One, I think something that does, a case, Stout v. Jefferson, I don't know if people are familiar with this. This was a case that was brought, it's out of Alabama. It's actually a revigoration of a desegregation order that happened back in 1965, I believe. And it was something actually that occurred while I was at the department in the Office of Civil Rights. And essentially the Gardendale School District in Alabama wanted to secede from the Jefferson County. If you recall, maybe you've heard of this, they wanted to secede. And the reason is because they claimed they wanted to secede because they wanted local control. However, they failed to recognize that they were actually still under a desegregation order. So they didn't even give notice to the incoming superintendent that they were under a deseg order. So when they went to court in order to get the approval to go ahead and secede, they were met by the fierce force of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, as well as the Office of Civil Rights, that said, no, this actually is in violation and would create, that would undermine the desegregation order that the county is still under. But the terms used in that are important because the court ultimately, and this is being appealed, but the court ultimately ruled to allow for there potentially to be some type of forward movement if they wanted to succeed further down the line, but they did find that there was an intent that the intent behind their secession movement was actually to discriminate and was racist, and to exclude students from the Gardendale school district, because that was a majority. Those are the students that were being bused in. Yet they didn't have any care about another school district that was 98% white that could also potentially be bused in. That wasn't their concern. So the claim about local control was essentially a euphemistic term that was being used in order to in order to ensure that they would not have to integrate or desegregate in their classroom. It was euphemistically used in order to, in a way that we hear so much, in order to get around the racist intent behind what they were trying to achieve. And so I use that case to say this, that terms matter. And so if you're going to talk about, when you hear local control, when you hear, and let's just talk about the evolution of terms, you hear first, desegregation and Brown v. Board, and integration, you kind of talk, those terms often are used hand in hand. They're not the same, but you kind of use interchangeably. Then you go to affirmative action, either in the K through 12 or in context. Diversity as case law evolved, because you didn't want to just say it was deseg, because that brought up connotations of busing, and said there was a nicer term that was used, it became diversity. And then you start hearing about local control, and then about going back to state flexibility, and then you hear about school choice, all right? Now, where else do you hear about state flexibility in my 0 minutes? State flexibility and local control. Exactly, in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And at the Department of Education, we were dealing with that. That was the basis for pushing ESSA to go back to this local control, the state flexibility. As someone who has studied the law, they said, study Brown v. Board, understand the legal ramifications of what state control means, all I heard when I hear state flexibility is states' rights. Mm-hmm. And so what should advocates know about vouchers and neo-vouchers? Local control, state flexibility equals state rights, okay? Mm-hmm. And that, let's just put it, call the elephant out in the room, all right? It doesn't, a pig is a pig no matter what you call it. Exactly, no matter how much lipstick it wears. So that's what it is. And so that's why I bring up the case, but I also say in the Department of Education, a couple of things that we tried to do, in addition to trying to tamp down on any expansion of the DC voucher program, because that was coming from Congress. We had little ability to try to stop it. At the same time, we could try to limit the expansion of that. And we did attempt to do that in order to make sure that, hey, look, you all said that this program has to exist, but you don't have to expend all the money, because you've got students in school right now who, if you're saying if they're going to matriculate throughout the entire program, you won't have enough money left. So let's keep enough money there for them. So you can't use all this money. There are ways and efforts that we try to ensure that, look, be true to what you claim that you're trying to do with this program. Secondly, we tried to ensure that diversity and integration was a priority, all right? Because we knew it went hand in hand. So when you talk about, again, school choice efforts and what have you, we knew that part of this was not trying to ensure that there's diverse integrated classrooms, both out, the school, the classroom, and then also in the teaching workforce. And then thirdly, we did a lot of trying to just talk about in ESSA concerns, and part of my responsibility at the department was also overseeing the issuance of guidance for ESSA. So for Title II and Title I and Title IV, all those programs, the grants. So to talk about, in your school improvement programs, maybe you should talk about diversity. Maybe if you're having problems in the quality of education and the students are underperforming, then ways to improve that would be to look at the whether or not they are fully integrated, whether or not there's a diverse classroom, because this is part and parcel of having a quality education. So with that, just bringing it all together as I conclude after I've already gone over 7 minutes, it's just to say that you have to put all of this in context. That what advocates should know is that vouchers are still, vouchers, privatization, this is really about the exclusion of students, all right? And that the idea of local control and vouchers really belies this type of selfishness and sensitivity and a disregard for the historical context of public education, a fundamental misunderstanding what the public education system is and should be about, and the correct use of taxpayer dollars. And so I want you to go about this and think about it in that context. So when you get the pushback from those who say, but this is the evolution of Brown v. Board, repeat back to them what I said. That is not the evolution of Brown v. Board. Do not pervert the true meaning and the good work of Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and all of those who fought so hard to ensure that we have the quality education for all of our students. That vouchers is about exclusion. Public education is about everyone and ensuring that they all have the right to a quality education. And if you're not about that business, then you shouldn't be in this area at all. So that's what
Yeah, do you have questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody? Yep, go ahead, Frank.
I would like to hear from the panel about short and long-term strategies for stalling and or countering these moves along the different dimensions that you talked about, especially at the legal and political ones.
Pick the junior scholar here. I think that's a very tough question, and I was there at the luncheon where we discussed sort of what would schools look like if sort of vouchers and neo-vouchers and school choice sort of had their way, right? I think the resistance is multifaceted and unpredictable. If someone tells you differently, they have a crystal ball that I don't have. For example, in Arizona, who would have predicted that there would have been an uprising, a grassroots uprising that pushed back against this in Arizona, right? So to me, that is one example of how we can sort of resist, is by us collaborating, connecting, and pushing back on this at our state level. Secondly, Texas I brought up.
Mm-hmm.
Texas is really interesting because it didn't pass, by the way. As I didn't mention it as one of the states. It was close, but it didn't pass. There wasn't a popular grassroots uprising there. It was one person who had a lot of power, who had the decision, and this was the chair of the education committee, Republican, who did not want it to go forward. So sometimes we don't know where people pop up and how they wake up in the morning, and what allies and what allies we can actually create. From a policy perspective, though, I think there's a couple of things. One is using those same state rights, and I think sort of progressives need to get better at using state rights in terms of creating avenues that actually prohibit these things from happening, so some protection. So for example, creating more stringent laws about how public funds can be used. So for example, Nevada is in a really interesting place because they actually passed a universal ESA program. So far, no, Arizona hasn't passed it because there was pushback from the citizenry. Nevada didn't pass it because now they need to create a funding mechanism or a new funding stream that would fund ESA programs. So sometimes it's sort of understanding sort of the complexity. So one is creating policies, one that makes it more difficult to impossible for ESA programs and other voucher-like programs to actually be implementable, right? So meaning right now, it's really gonna be difficult for Nevada to implement a universal model. Secondly, create policies that do not allow the expansion of ESAs. So another strategy of pro-ESAs is for them to actually start really small and then start nibbling at your toe and then your foot and then they're up to your neck, you know? So really trying to sort of prohibit sort of the expansion of those. So I guess those would be some strategies, but again, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer.
Can you go back to the slide that I did? I will say, I
I will
think,
try.
yeah, that's fine. One of the strategies I think you could use is also to highlight the lack of protections that are provided for students within voucher programs. As was indicated, and that the traditional vouchers often has certain stipulations that have come into play. Either they have to, they're supposed to be for students who are in failing schools or low-income students. They can
Which slide am I
so
looking
go
for?
to slide 12, please. Yeah. So oftentimes they have certain stipulations, but typically you're going to have certain fundamental rights that are lost by students as they go into private schools. And this kind of just gives you the overlay of the variety of statutes that are challenged when students go into these voucher programs, because understand that many of these voucher programs, neo-voucher programs, students are going to religious schools, religious-based schools, which are going to either, they have the right to discriminate based upon religion, based upon sex, gender. So you have, for example, the school, Lutheran schools, in fact, one was just taken away. Will discriminate based upon LGBT status. Students with disabilities are not going to have the same protections within private schools. So an avenue for advocacy on this is to really come to work with those other organizations that are advocating on behalf of these particular populations, vulnerable populations. So students with disabilities, strong advocacy in community, and have been really one of our great allies in pushing back on this, as well as again, those who are advocating on behalf of Title IX, ensuring gender equality. I'll also say, avenues, for example, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State, advocate on ensuring that you're separating and don't have the proliferation of religion within schools and being paid for taxpayer dollars. But then lastly, I'll also say that, there was one more that I just,
Open records?
yeah, there's that, but there was something else I was getting at. But my point is that there are different categories of student populations that have advocacy communities behind them that I think you can come together with, and then focus on kind of that lack of accountability and loss of federal protections that are needed for those students.
It's interesting that slide that I just had up a second ago of the abuses and what Oscar and Tanya were both talking about are up here, right? So there's the open records is number 1, discrimination is number 3, right? And 8 was the camel's nose, right? So the cynical uses of vulnerable populations. And I would say that in answer to Frank's question, I think that these concerns and abuses, a lot of which have been focused on more by the press than by researchers. So in Florida in particular, the journalists have done a pretty good job of pointing out and uncovering some of these abuses, particularly financial abuses. But I was gonna, the one I want to touch on here, thinking about this, is number 10, which I sort of threw in and haven't thought about much. But I wonder, in terms of sort of a coalition of opposition, what this does is it tells people who are interested in making a charitable contribution, we, the government, are putting our thumb on the scale. If you want to give this to your local orchestra or park or library or any other charity that you favor, a homeless shelter or the junior league, whatever it is, that's okay, and we'll give you a little bit of a deduction on that. But if you really want to do something with your charitable money, we really think you should be putting it over here, and we'll give you up to 100% deduction. So different from state to state, but it might be 65%, it might be 90%, it might be 100%. And it seems like, I'm just sort of thinking through this, it seems like other charitable institutions besides private schools might disfavor that. So that's one
Pit 'em against one
question.
another.
What was that?
Pit them against one another.
Well, I wasn't thinking of it that way. But no, I mean, it certainly seems unfair if I'm running a charity that the government is saying, well, some charities are more equal than others. It doesn't seem very kind.
Equitable.
Yeah, equitable. But yeah, so that's just one additional thought.
So I have a question. When you all talk about vouchers and neo-vouchers and all of this, what is the conversation like about the intent behind vouchers? I want you all to talk a little bit about the intent to undermine and destroy public schools, and also you mentioned ALEC in one of your slides, ALEC and organizations like ALEC that are run by corporations that have an intent to siphon off the huge amounts of money that go into public education, the public education space. Can y'all talk a little bit more about the intent to dismantle public schools through vouchers, neo-vouchers, and other similar type programs, and also the organizations kind of behind that, and why that's one of the talking points that folks need to realize is that they're trying to siphon off money for profit for other institutions and friends and cronies and things like that.
I guess I'll start with this one. So I think that the people who advocate for these things are coming from a variety of different places, right? So some feel that it's unfair that they can't send their kids to a school and get religious training, which is very important to them as part of the education. And so they're coming from sort of the old-fashioned reason for wanting government support. Some are essentially looking to make a buck, as you say. And I think the strongest and most powerful group is sort of the Cato Institute, sort of people who are vehemently against the idea of government schools, right? This is an anathema to the core idea that we're not a socialist country, right? And why do we have a social institution that keeps hanging on? So it's about time we got rid of that institution, and this is a way to do that. I do think that that's the end game for a lot of people who favor this. I think for our current Secretary of Education, it probably is. And there is a growing and powerful group that favors these policies, I think, for that simple reason. I think you also see people, just to add one more, who are just looking for any way to undermine teachers' unions, which there's a partisan political thing there because most of the money goes to Democratic candidates. And people who see bureaucratic institutions, so this sort of gets a little bit into the Cato area, but not, a lot of these people might not go that far, but who see the dysfunction of bureaucratic institutions as a problem and are looking for ways to break that down.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I remember being in a panel similar to this in Boulder, and someone asked, well, what should I tell my neighbor or my brother, I think was the example, my brother who has a special needs student or child and can use the ESA eligibility to select and go to a private school that would meet their needs. So I think this notion of personalizing our communication to our neighbors, to our social networks is really important to get at this issue. Because if we don't, then we don't understand what role we play in privatizing public education. Because we all could play a role. So the response would be something like this. Well, do you know that if you accept the ESA program, that you will actually be taking away those funds from other students in public education? Many people don't know that. They literally do not know that it's not in a vacuum, that we live in sort of this integrated. So highlighting that aspect about how your individual choice, right, the word choice, has consequences. Secondly, and Tanya brought this up, Do you know that private schools may not provide the same protections and services that a public school would provide? Many folks don't know that. Third, are you sure that the private school would accept your child? Right? It's not a given. So I think unpacking the consequences of choice and how choice at an individual helps to promote or hinder the privatization of schools is really important. So I guess that's sort of my sort of personal response.
So ditto to everything that's already been said, and I'll just add that I think you talk about the intent behind vouchers and there are differing intents. I don't think that everybody is genuine in their intent. So let's just call that out. That while some parents may not be fully versed and understand the impact and the proper use of federal taxpayer dollars in a system that we have here in the United States, a democratic system, they might not, so I think that education about that will work. There are other parents who don't care.
Right.
They don't care. And there are some parents that not only don't care, this is exactly what they want. They didn't want their child to be next to a child my child.
Right.
Okay? So there are many intents behind this. Not everybody, everybody we walk up to who maybe supports these are not going to have that same intent. However, the result is the same. And I think that we need to call that out and say that while you may claim that you have a different intent from your other colleague there, you all are still swimming in the same waters. All right? And so, guilt by association. And understand that ultimately what you are doing is eliminating and undermining the entire fabric of the system that this country was built, that has been created to benefit all students. So not everybody, again, is going to care about that, but I think that there is a fundamental lack of understanding about our democratic system, honestly. And there's this belief that you can just take your money and do what you want with it. Yet they don't feel that way when it comes to roads, trash collection, for making sure that the DMV is open when they need it to be open. Taxpayer dollars can go to all that other stuff, and yes, I'll put my money in, but when it comes to schools, I'm going to take my money out. And I don't care about that other child that lives next door to me. All right? And so we need to call that out and be honest about it and force them to confront that and not hide behind these very euphemistic terms of local control, of state flexibility, all right? And then work from there because, and then lastly, I'll just say, there's a privilege that comes with being able to say that I'm gonna take my money and go to every other school. Not other parents don't have that privilege, all right? And we need to call that privilege out as well.
I live in Indiana where we have almost all the camel in the tent, except for the education savings account. We have SGOs, right, which is scholarship granting.
Yeah.
So we have that tax credit stuff, and we have the vouchers, and they sold it as you would expect, and then expanded it such that I think you can have a family of 4 now and get a partial scholarship if you make like $100,000. So it's not even about poor children anymore, it's just about choice. And it's not about results either, because most voucher schools do much poorer on those tests that they claim to be a measurement of success. My question is, this is Alec, and our education House Committee chairman was Alec chairman of our state for 8 years. Everything that comes out is Alec. And is there any language, because they really have they have done a beautiful job of messaging and using language that is very easy to sucker people and say, we have choice scholarships, and it sounds so
We have an
explicit.
empowerment account.
Yeah, empowerment counts, and it's all else on there, but is there language for when this, because I fully expect the special needs scholarship thing to be coming up either this session or the next one, of like, do you think that saying debit card education is a good way to frame it? Because we have to figure out how we can message quickly, because this is coming probably for us in January or the January after.
I'll let the legal scholars.
Oh, and also a story, because they like stories, and every time I watch these sessions, they get a parent there who says, you know, my special needs child has fallen through the cracks in the public education system, and these terrible things have happened, and deserves to go over to that school right here that has a little Jesus besides. Sorry,
I would, this actually goes also back to another question was raised about other advocates. One thing that I didn't say, which I think would be helpful, is that families in rural areas hate this because it does not benefit. Now that is a demographic that is different from what most people think.
Right.
They think that that particular demographic would be supporting vouchers, but they don't. We need to utilize that, and we need to make sure that when the other side is presenting, because they do this, and this has happened, it's particularly annoying and offensive, and y'all can speak to how this always happens. You get the African American bishop, Baltimore, Harry Jackson, among winner. Okay, I'm calling names out, I'll stop. But you get particular, you'll get an African American mother with her 6 children, because they always gotta find that.
Right.
And say that, oh, little Johnny should deserve the same choice of Sally over here. You know, you're right. Every child deserves the right to a quality education. That's why we have a public school system that you're not funding.
Right, exactly.
So I would say definitely take advantage,
The rural.
allies in the rural communities, put that face forward. And in terms of messaging, yeah, I mean, we're continually working on that. I know that even, organizations that I've been a part of, even with PFAW, but also on the national level, National Coalition for Public Education that I also work with, that does a lot of advocacy on these federal legislative bills, has messaging out there as well. I think it's a matter of us coordinating and putting our heads together and making sure that information is dispersed.
Yeah.
So I think we can, and I'll talk to Karen, I think there are messages that we have tried to kind of figure out that might work. But yeah, anyway, I'll stop.
So, every time I look at this, it looks like Ed Choice is showing the U.S. breaking out in measles. Chicken pox, there you go. But this slide that I had up earlier, I would say, I haven't thought about it this way, but each one of these items has personal stories that can be attached to them. And I do find that those, I'm awful at this. I'm an academic, and I like to talk in numbers and generalities and sort of study shows this sort of thing, which is not compelling for audiences. Sorry, but there are these have journalistic accounts attached to them. They have stories and real people attached to them. So particularly the discrimination ones, I think. The story of someone who was kicked out of the private school, particularly in Florida or someplace where they're getting the subsidies. The stories about financial abuse and fraud that is rampant. I mean, they're not hard to find at all. Maybe stories around tuition hikes. I really wanted to send my kid to private school. They promised this, but I couldn't possibly afford it. And in fact, you mentioned that Indiana means testing is well into the middle class.
Yeah.
That's something that we see a lot, and there's research behind this that shows that when you provide a subsidy like that, the people who take advantage of it are at the high end of the means test. So it's for all the reasons that we already understand.
Right.
It's sort of common sense. There are some laws, like the new one in Illinois, that tries to tier things. Have tiers where TIER, not TE. So that you have the initial money going to lower income groups, but it's always you can't bracket that. You can't bracket the larger societal inequalities. The number 5 there, I'm not going to even try to explain, it'll take too long, but that involves wealthy people who are essentially making money by avoiding the alternative minimum tax, because in short, the alternative minimum tax does not allow you to deduct state tax money, but it does allow you to deduct charitable contributions. So that by moving it from state tax to charity, they actually found a way to pay less taxes. Administrative cuts in Arizona in particular, you'll find great stories about people making tons of money, including Steve Yarborough, who's in the state legislature and sponsors this legislation, makes tons of money on the, I think it's Steve. Yeah. So anyway, the idea that you could take this 10% cut in running this organization and use it for whatever expenses you think are appropriate and make quite a bit of money. Carol?
What about arguments to, I've read a lot about this, especially in Arizona, senior citizens? I mean, you're talking about a lot of waste. You bring out the waste, you bring out the abuse. This is your tax dollars. Now we're applying 3 systems. Hey, all the schools were good enough for your kids. To me, I mean, that's almost a slogan. I think that the senior population, I want Diane to write for AARP, because I think senior citizens who didn't have this, right, who's going to take a look at this and just see this as, these are my tax dollars going into all of these. Right, I mean, there were terrible problems in Arizona that keep coming out with people abuse the money.
But keep in mind, in places like Arizona, the senior citizens are who have relatives and friends are all asked to donate an earmark for those schools and those children.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're sort of brought into, there's sort of a constituency being formed.
That's the problem with all of these issues.
That's it, we've answered all your questions?
Well, we do have, I think there is I briefly mentioned some of the religious components of this. In terms of advocacy, there are a variety of religious-based and faith-based organizations that are in stark opposition to vouchers. I think we need to take advantage of that. So, you got yours, we got ours. Everybody has it, but my point is that there are, from UCC, United Church of Christ, there's the Progressive Baptist, there's National Council of Churches. There's so many religious based organizations and associations that also will stand with you as you're trying to fight for quality public education. And I think that's always good to have that because they can speak in ways that is different from what we are maybe have the credibility in speaking on. I go to church, I listen to my pastor, but you're not going to hear me quoting the Bible. I don't pretend to be something that I'm not. And I think you need to have the credibility there of those who understand the full and the real and the appropriate and contextual interpretation of text to be able to speak to so they have that moral authority to be able to say, you know what this is about the uplifting and providing for my brother's keeper. That concept of ensuring that we are looking out for all, ensuring that we all have the opportunity to succeed. That basic concept is something I think that others can appreciate, but they have to hear it in different ways.
Tomorrow at brunch, you're going to hear from the head of Pastors for Texas Children, who was really, really key in fighting back on vouchers in the state of Texas. So there is an organization, Charles Forster Johnson, and he is dynamite, and he'll be speaking with you.